Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me today to introduce to you Dr. John Caffey, who for 35 years was radiologist at Columbia University Medical Center in the Department of Radiology at the Children's Hospital. Dr. Caffey currently is at the University of Pittsburgh at Children's Hospital there and has kindly consented to visit us today and give us a first-hand account of how pediatric radiology evolved and how it began. Dr. Caffey, why did pediatric radiology develop at the time that it did?
Well, there are several reasons, and basic. I'd like to make a little preamble that radiographic examination in infants and children is more helpful to the pediatrician than radiographic examination of adults is to the internist, for some pretty obvious reasons, but we sometimes forget, is that the histories in pediatrics are often misleading because they must come from the mother in large part for infants and younger children, and the mother may give an accurate history, or she may give feelings, emotional stories that she has, or there are sometimes purposely misleading to take a trip to Florida or California, something of that sort. And, of course, an active, frightened child is much more difficult to examine. So that I think there's no question that pediatric Röntgen examinations are really more needed than they are in internal medicine. And that's the one reason why I think there's been an impetus toward this, although it was held up for other reasons. Pediatric radiology really couldn't develop until the generators became higher powered and the recording medium more sensitive. That is, you couldn't get a good film with a short exposure. And these things came together and happened in sometime in the 1920s. Prior to that time, pediatric radiology had been done largely by people who are not specially interested in it, who came into even large children's hospitals for a few hours a week and were usually in a hurry on their way through the hospital, and they would read the films. Very little fluoroscopy was done. They were not available for, that is, the radiologists at that time were not available for conferences or discussions with the house staff or senior staff about the patients. They didn't come to regular rounds or anything of that sort. They were sort of fly-by-night through the hospital and disappeared. But when the technical factors became possible and radiologists became full-time appointments at the larger pediatric units, then the whole picture changed, because these men were available for consultations with the staff. They were there all day, and they did fluoroscope. And I think it was Dr. Lynn that really, I count that the beginning of pediatric radiology. Not formally, but this is what really went on. And this was in between 1925 and 1930. Dr. Vogt was appointed full-time at the Boston Children's Hospital in 1927 or 8. I became full-time, and I think we were the first full-time people. And I would count that as the beginning and the reasons for the slow up.
Well, how did you turn to radiology? How did you make that decision?
Well, there was no really good reason for turning to it. And as Dr. Rigler mentioned this morning, that he went into adult radiology early in the game because largely of luck and circumstances. Mine was very peculiar, and this is the only anecdote I have for your questions, that we used to have 1 hour X-ray demonstration, review the films of the week at Babies in New York. And they were doing the best they could, but we had an old pathologist who sort of took responsibility for the X-ray meetings and didn't pretend to be a radiologist. And walking out of one of those one day, a friend of mine said, well, what did you think of today's session? And I said, I think it's a bloody waste of time, or something like that. And Herbert B. Wilcox, who was professor of pediatrics at Columbia, Carpentier professor, said, do you really believe that? And I couldn't say no. I just said it. So I said, yes, I think we did waste time today. And he said, do you think you could do any better? And again, I was a little bit in the corner. And I said, yes, I think I could do it almost as well as we did today. And he patted me on the back and said, Jack, you're our radiologist. This is literally true. I was a happy pediatrician at the time with no intention of ever, because I knew nothing about radiology. So I went around to try to see how you could get into how I could learn pediatric radiology. In doing it, I found that men like Ross Golden, who was mentioned this morning, there were 5 professors of radiology, I think, at the time. I talked to all of them, and I found that although they were experts on gallbladders in adults and gastric ulcers and things of that sort, that they had had no experience with children, practically. That is, the common diseases of bones are rickets, scurvy, and syphilis that time, and they were, and they didn't pretend to know it. Primary tuberculosis, they were practically, they knew all about apical tuberculosis, post-primary, but not primary tuberculosis. So, and it was so interesting that I just gradually realized that there were many people looking at X-ray films of children who didn't know any more than I did, and I might catch up someday. And so I went right on, and Wilcox stood by his word, which I wasn't sure he was going to do, and I was made the radiologist. The thing that saved me, we had a middle-aged man who was a technician. I was younger then, of course. And he was the best technician I've ever encountered up this time. See, I had no technical training. Rigler was a very educated radiologist as compared to me. I literally knew nothing. But I developed clinically, and I found that this is really a clinical activity, that we are clinicians that use this method for diagnosis. And I think it's very difficult to be accurate and useful. Many people have done it, Ed Newhouser's one, without having a pretty good idea of clinical pediatrics, the pathology of the clinical diseases. And I had that edge when I started. And I thought I would make a lot of mistakes, and I read films very cautiously. And I didn't make any mistakes that caught up with me, at least, which might happen. And then, to my surprise, when I'd been in about 6 months and hadn't even hardly started it, I started getting films as an expert, because somebody said they have a new radiologist down at Baby's Hospital. And within 2 years, I was getting films from South Africa, South America, Australia. But with this clinical background, it was a great protection against making mistakes. That is, I never overshot the mark. My errors were probably underdiagnosis rather than overdiagnosis.
You had no Caffey's textbook of pediatric X-ray diagnosis to fall back on. What did you read to learn more about entities? I
asked Dr. Rigler what he considered the most valuable book, and I agreed that Kohler's book on the normal variants, I've forgotten the exact title, the book is Borderline Radiology. I would say that's by far the most important X-ray book ever written for anyone, because there is no other book on it. And I have majored in my book on normal variants, particularly in the skeleton.
Dr. Caffey, pediatric radiology has made many significant contributions to the understanding of diseases in children, and I think foremost among those is our concept of the battered child. What, in your opinion, are the milestones that we've passed in contributions that pediatric radiology has made?
Well, I think the major contribution is the total accuracy of diagnosis generally in pediatrics. feature that had the greatest impact when people started using radiology more was the prompt diagnosis of the congenital obstructions and stenoses in the alimentary tract, most of which could be cured by surgery. And if you realize that at that time there were no pediatric surgeons, that many of these children died with the ordinary stenosis in the duodenum that we think nothing of now. But at that time, if an infant had an obstruction like that, that someone would look at the formula and the milk was too high or the carbohydrate was too low, and they juggled formulas, and children actually died in hospitals with operable, curable stenosis of the duodenum. You know, it's an easy thing to do. So this, I think, was by far the most important immediate effect. And then there are the corrections of not new discoveries, but the corrections of errors that had been made earlier. The thymus, I would cite, as the radiation of the thymus, the inducement of thyroid carcinoma. This was rampant when I first came in. And we knew almost from clinically that this was wrong. And I think one of the greatest services I did, and people have given me credit perhaps more than I really did, is the destruction of the thymus myth, that the large thymus was abnormal or that this irradiation would cure or prevent anything. Along with that, the diagnosis of primary tuberculosis from hilum enlargement, and many patients, I'm sure, had heart disease with large pulmonary arteries. I think we cleaned up some of the osteochondroses that were missed, Sever's disease of the heel, Van Eyck's disease in the pelvis. So those corrections are a common problem. Most of the children didn't have syphilis, and the children that had syphilis had bone changes, which are very important, and they're forgotten about sometimes. These were trophic changes from interfering with growth from a severe disease and were not due to syphilis at all. Those corrections are easily forgotten, were tremendously important, and the pediatric radiologists that came in and stopped a lot of that had never been stopped unless they had stopped it.
Well, the life of the cardiac surgeon, the neurosurgeon, has been made much easier by the development of sophisticated cardiac angiography and neuroradiological procedures. Where does this fit into the scheme of advances in pediatric radiology?
They originated with the heart work was basic heart work. I think was not done by pediatricians. The basic work in neurosurgery was not done. Accessible for training, and particularly the neurosurgery, I think, is advanced diagnosis by itself. That the neuroradiologists are probably, as a group, as well informed on conditions in the infantile skull as most pediatric radiologists. But we were, I don't agree with that or not, but they had a very large advance on. I know at the Neurological Institute, I can't remember doing anything for them that they did a lot for me, accepting things like diagnosis of tuberculosis and things of that sort in other parts of the body, but not for the evaluation of hydrocephalus and things of that sort. They were exceptionally good, the neurosurgeons in there.
Can you share with us any anecdotes or opinions about radiology at the turn of the century? Any of the great names that are known to all of us?
Well, I came in sort of through the back door, and I was not personally acquainted with the radiological people as I was with the pediatricians. And from a standpoint of development, historically, I think Dr. Roach, who's the first professor of pediatrics in Boston, would be called the father of pediatric radiology, which I've stated several times, because he published a book, 1910 or 12, I think, and in it he had 2,500 mentioned you had 2,500 examinations they'd done in one year. I know he's a very important man. Holt, on the other hand, at Columbia, who's the second professor of pediatrics, never paid much attention to X-ray and didn't think he needed it. He thought physical examination was. And I think really X-ray was sort of forced on Holt by his son, Emmett Holt Jr., that Holt was not a leader at all in stimulating the radiological examination of infants. But there have been many other people, of course, who have, pediatricians who have helped radiology. I'll tell you about Ashley Weech at the Children's Hospital in Cincinnati. When he went from babies to Cincinnati, he had only been there about 6 months when he wrote and asked me to look out for a man and pediatric radiology so they could have the same kind of radiology there that we had at Columbia. And fortunately for us, and I think for Fred Silverman, he was the first man. Now, the same thing happened at Pittsburgh, and Bert Gardani was the man. So those two people right away branched. It's interesting how good your first men are that come in. Have you noticed that? A new man will start out head of a department, and usually his first or second man he has there will be perhaps his most illustrious graduate in that.
The men that you've trained made notable contributions in various aspects of pediatric radiology, and particularly as I look at the field, it was a matter of pattern recognition, whereas the young academic radiologist today tends to go into the research laboratory to use radiological techniques to investigate physiological parameters. What do you think is the development of the field in the future? Is it going to go along the lines of physiological research?
I think this is the thrust of today. I think Rigler said this morning about the catheter, and I think this is true. But I think you need both very badly, and I think my own career, Fred Silverman, other people indicate that if you are close to the patient, there are a lot of clinical entities that are very important that need radiographic evaluation, and I hope we can have both. But I think immediately you can get more funding and get more resources for non-clinical investigation. And I think the newborn and fetus is going to be certainly for 10 years or so, the most important thrust of pediatric radiology. I know you probably are better informed in this than I am, but from looking at it, I would say this is from the standpoint of genetics and many other things. That is, Röntgen methods are being used to get fluid that makes diagnosis. You see that kind of thing in the...
Dr. Caffey, how did pediatric radiologists first come to get together and organize to share ideas and concepts with one another?
Well, they did it simply by personal friendships for a while, and there were no pediatric radiologists that I knew well. Of course, Vogt was the only other man that was in the field when I started. But Karshner in the University of Southern California, I think, at the Children's Hospital, was doing general work, but he still had done some very good work on anemias and bone changes. This was a very long time ago. And Ralph, I forget, I'll have his name in a minute, in Philadelphia, really went to the Children's Hospital there, although again he had a mixed practice. And there were these people who had this interest in pediatric radiology that were never listed as pediatric radiologists. Those, I think, were the real pioneers in the...
And how did the Society for Pediatric Radiology come to be?
Well, it was a very important development, and we didn't know really how to organize it, or whether to organize it as a branch of pediatrics or a branch of radiology. And Harry Backwin was head of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I had seen the advantage to Silverman and Gardani and myself of being a pediatrician, having pediatric clinical experience. So we tried it out. We had a meeting of pediatric radiologists before the Academy of Pediatric meeting, just like this was here before the X-ray, in New York City, and 17 persons turned up. And the same year, Ed Newhouser organized a meeting a day before the American Röntgen Ray Society. And I think there are 55 or something like that. So this showed very clearly that there'd be greater interest if we had this as a radiological society rather than a pediatric society. And of course this provided a forum for discussions, presentation materials, meeting of friends, and a thing that isn't emphasized, sizing up the young men in need, which I think was important. There's somebody in Washington State or Oregon might not have heard of some very good man he'd like to engage, and they would all be at the meetings, and this man would present a paper effectively, and it tightened up the whole structure, made friendships, and people are invited to go back and forth. I think it's one of the very important activities that has made pediatric as strong as it is, pediatric radiology. Also, it has been copied in almost every country in Europe. And the French Pediatric Society is almost a direct offshoot of... I think, again, largely due to Newhouser's sort of an ambassador of goodwill. And Fred Silverman has been very close to the French, so that this society has had tremendous influence on the developments, and all to the good, I think.
Was the development of pediatric radiology in Europe simultaneous with the development in the United States?
No, we've been ahead of them, but in England now they have very large. I'm not sure that we are ahead of them quite a bit still, but it's been for other reasons. This country is very good, but you'd think they'd have more, really.
As you look back over the years, Dr. Caffey, what strikes you as being the most fun, most enjoyable things that have happened to you in pediatric radiology?
Oh, I think personally, my personal gratification has been very large, is that I went into internal medicine and I was deeply interested in it and pleased with it. I don't think I was cut out of diagnosis. That history is still the number one item. And to come into pediatrics and have to take this history from a mother who really doesn't know how the child feels, and oftentimes this has been developing so rapidly. Germany have, for example, have 2 or 3 to be a pediatrician, and because I used the history so carefully, and it wasn't as interesting as, and I suppose I would have gone on and practiced pediatrics, but diagnosis, that history is still the number one item. And to come into pediatrics and have to take this history from a mother who really doesn't know how the child feels, and oftentimes this wasn't as interesting as, and I suppose I would have gone on and practiced pediatrics, but I think the help we've given, you're being a consultant instead of a practitioner, and we are consultants really in diagnosis. I think that's been a great pleasure to me, is to be a doctor's doctor instead of being a patient's doctor. Now, some people wouldn't value that as highly as I do, but I think this is where you do the most good, is helping doctors.
If it's possible at all to do things differently as one goes down life's path, is there anything that you might have chosen to do differently?
I don't know. It's hard to... I think I would have... if there had been such an opportunity, or I would like to have studied Röntgen anatomy and its variants for about 3 years before I went in. And if I were a dictator for radiology, I would insist that everyone know Röntgen anatomy and the normal variants fully before they'd be allowed to practice. Most of the mistakes I've been seeing have been made on, not because the fellow didn't know some disease, because he didn't know he was looking at normal. This is why I think one of our greatest failures, and I asked Dr. Rigler today, why in the world hasn't somebody, someplace, provided a course of a year or 6 months to learn normal Röntgen anatomy? This is what I tried to do, you see, when Wilcox put me in this hole. And there was no place in the United States that you could, and in the world, I think. Well, surgeons study their anatomy. You can take courses in surgical anatomy all over the place, but not Röntgen anatomy. It's queer, really. No, of course, I think if you get into, especially in the early days, it probably is more fun than any other time. There are so many new things. It's exciting, thrilling activity. And so I feel very fortunate that I got in the very early days. And I think it's like being a pioneer in the West. I think the first people came out, they had more hardships, but they had more satisfactions of doing the thing. Then I think shouldn't say this if you're going to show this to other radiologists. I think that people in pediatric radiology are a cut above the general practice of radiology, not necessarily intellectually, but from a standpoint of being nice people, easy to get along with, pleasant people. I like the spirit in our meetings, I think, are, maybe it's because we have small societies, are very, very helpful. And we have this Caffey Society that is very small, and this is a great play. You can bring films. One film is all you have to bring it. So that I think smallness is a thing we'll have to watch, not to get it too large. In the United States, it's practically impossible.
Dr. Caffey, I think all of us are very appreciative of what you've done in the field, without doubt, and we certainly are appreciative of you taking time from your busy schedule to spend a few minutes with us. And
thank you very much. Could I emphasize that this developed as a group, some of us a little earlier than the others, but I don't think any one person should take too much credit for this, because there have been perhaps 8 or 9 or 10 people. I'm glad I was one of them, that's the point.
Thanks for joining us today.